and welcome back to interesting stuff. This is the homeschooling supplement where we pick up on a little piece or maybe a big piece of history and study it in just a little bit more detail. Today we are looking at the wars, or I'm subtitling this as How Stupid We Are, because fussing and fighting is really not the best way to go forward in life when we could all just love one another and get along and have a good time. Don't you think? Anyway, we begin with the First World War. On June the 28th, 1914, Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb, shot dead Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Habsburg Empire. This event is always cited as the primary cause of the war. However, in effect, it was just the straw that broke the back of a delicate balance of alliances and treaties. It led, like the toppling of one domino into another, to the collapse of world peace and a conflict that lasted for 5 years. In fact, all across Europe, there had been stresses between the different countries, especially since the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, and the fact that she had ruled with her Victorian Empire across all of Europe and large parts of the world. And in fact, her children and grandchildren were the rulers in most of the countries, from Russia out in the east all the way across to England on the west of Europe. And if you look at her family tree, it's pretty interesting to see what happened to the children and which families they married into and where they went. It's really worth digging into. Anyway, at the center of the conflict in the First World War was Germany, which was a military state wishing to expand its rule. Now, Archduke Ferdinand's death led to a declaration of war on Serbia by Austria. Germany, having promised support for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then declared war on Russia and then France. The German invasion of Belgium triggered the terms of the 1839 Treaty of London. You have to go way back to 1839 to find that treaty, meaning Britain was obliged to declare war on Germany. Yeah, be careful what you sign, guys. Be careful what you sign, because we've got people here in the early 20th century having to go to war because their grandfathers signed a treaty way back in 1839. Wow. So only 5 weeks after Princip pulled the trigger in his assassination, the world was at war. In fact, 5 years to the day after that shot was fired, the war was concluded with the signing of the Versailles Treaty. Now, it's not just about treaties and political decisions. It's really about people and the cost of war in terms of finances and resources and human lives and destruction. It's quite terrible. 20 million people died in the First World War, and 21 million were injured. And that is, these are startling statistics and figures, especially on top of the destruction of the economies and the loss of law and order and any regularity in people's lives. Quite crazy. There was also, towards the end of the war, a great outbreak of flu, which is very often credited with slowing down the pace of the war as well. Very interesting to look into. The war itself was essentially a failure to realize the fragility of human relationships. It was also the rise of industrial warfare, with factories producing guns and more modern killing machines, and governments scooping up the latest technology to give them even more power. It was also very profitable for banks as well. Now, after the First World War, which was called the Great War, everyone thought, well, we've learned our lesson, and it's not going to happen again. However, 20 years later, the Second World War began in 1939. Now, despite the fact that the last war had been the war to end all wars, this proved to be far from true. Many things led indirectly to the war, but much of the blame for the eventual conflict has been placed at the door of the Versailles Treaty by imposing economic and social conditions upon Germany, which at the time seemed fair, but have since been re-evaluated as harsh. The seeds were sown for a second war. Yeah, it is hard for a country when you are economically restricted, when you can't import and export. It's extremely stressful for economies. The resentment Germany's people and politicians felt towards these punishments, combined with the difficulty the country had in repairing its economy after the First War, created a fertile ground for the rise of the National Socialists. So, on the 3rd of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. This was 2 days after Germany invaded Poland. It was not until Japan and then Germany declared war on America in December 1941 that the USA joined the Allied forces. And by then, everybody was involved in one way or another or forced to take sides. After 5 years of horror and bloodshed, Germany surrendered on the 7th of May 1945. Japan followed on the 14th of August after Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been annihilated by atomic bombs dropped by the US Army. Once again, the rise of new sciences and technologies played a huge factor in the outcome of the war. In all, 50 million people died during the conflict, and only 30% of these were soldiers. Russia suffered the biggest losses, losing 20 million people in the war. And the war itself created its heroes, Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt, and its villains, Hitler and Mussolini. And maybe rightly so, although the more we look back into history, the more we learn about the choices people made. And not everything is what it seems at first. Remember, the Versailles Treaty seemed fair at the beginning. But of course, war is much more complex than political decisions. It's really a study of the human condition and the ego on a personal level as much as anything else. Now, you and I both know that war and such conflicts are really not a good idea in society, and perhaps that's why we should not give too much power to the political decision makers and the politicians and the governments, because there's a lot of profit to be made in the conflicts that exist, especially if you are funding both sides of them. So there we go. That's a brief overview of the two great wars of the last century. And of course, there are many other conflicts that have been going on around the world in between. Some get publicized much more than others. That's another factor to think about. So we know it's not a good road to go down. And so let's work towards peace. It's that simple. Let's work towards a more peaceful future where we can just all get along in one way or another. I hope you enjoyed this, and as usual, there'll be extra questions in the links under the video. And that's it for today. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, have a great day, and be thankful for the world we live in.